Lamentations is so called because it consists of a series of laments. The Hebrew title of the book is Ekar, how, because the first word of the book is how, and the Hebrew tradition very often was to name books after their first word.
In Hebrew, it's echa, and it's sort of a crying out. It's asking God, how can you let this happen?
Basically, the book is divided into 5 chapters, and the 5 chapters of the English translations correspond to 5 distinct poems in the Hebrew. What's characteristic about them is that they have what's called an acrostic form. That is, you have successive verses beginning with successive letters of the Hebrew alphabet.
It looks a little different from, if you look at the text, it's a little different in the way it's just structured or laid out. So that's Lamentations, and then you look at like Ezekiel, just paragraphs. This is really a stylistic choice on our part, but this helps show that it's poetic. So the structure is, especially, it comes out more in the Hebrew than it does in the English, but it's just structured differently.
Traditionally, these 5 poems, laments, poems of lamentation, were ascribed to the prophet Jeremiah, and that's why in the Old Greek translation of the Bible, the Septuagint, and in later English versions and so on, that's why they're put after the book of Jeremiah itself. Actually, in the Hebrew Bible, they stand not with the book of Jeremiah, they're not among the prophets, they stand completely separately in the 3rd section of the Hebrew Bible, the writings. The traditional ascription to Jeremiah is not very likely. There are a number of ways in which the kind of stance and perspective represented in the poems differs from the kind of stance and perspective towards events that you meet in the book of Jeremiah. But they are concerned, as the book of Jeremiah is concerned, this is the subject of these poems of lament, with the fall of Jerusalem, the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple by the Babylonians in the year 587 BC.
The author just goes through describing how terrible the destruction of Jerusalem, how terrible the destruction of the temple of Jerusalem is.
Well, the temple in Jerusalem had been built by Solomon about 350 years and more before this time. And it came to play a very important part in the experience, the life, the worship of the people of Judah and Jerusalem in particular. Special beliefs were associated with it. There was the special belief, the tradition that was handed on, that God had not only chosen David, King David, and the royal house of David, his descendants, to rule forever over the people, but that he had also promised to be present, to make his presence known in a special and distinct way in and through the temple in Jerusalem. And you can imagine, therefore, when so much religious and emotional investment, as you might say, had gone into the temple, that its destruction was a terrible kind of psychic blow.
Well, we know about the destruction of Jerusalem, which is the capital city of the southern kingdom of Israel, through other biblical texts. So the end of 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles mentions, that's how they end. The city is destroyed, the whole region is destroyed, and they carry off the people into exile. So in addition to the biblical texts that reference the destruction of Judah, we also have Babylonian external sources that mention the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple, and of the exile of its people.
Oh, it was simply razed to the ground. It was simply destroyed by the Babylonians in 587. The city was besieged some months prior to its destruction. Sometimes, of course, besieging powers would be lenient towards a city if it opened its gates and capitulated to the besiegers. In the case of Jerusalem, that seems not to have happened, and so the city was destroyed. A terrible kind of vengeance was wreaked on it.
It is, in a sense, a depressing text, because it goes through their grief. At the same time, there's this glimmer of hope. that God will be able to help us. God is the one who saves us. And then at the end, praying to God to do that. You wouldn't have Lamentations, in essence, if they didn't believe that God would be the one who had saved them. That's the only reason why they're calling out. How? Remember. So traditionally, this book is attributed to Jeremiah the prophet. And part of that is due to a reference to it in 2 Chronicles 35, which is a historical book in the Bible. And it says that Jeremiah also uttered a lament for Josiah, and all the singing men and singing women have spoken of Josiah in their laments to this day. So there's sort of a case there for it being from Jeremiah.
We don't really know who might have written the poems of Lamentations. Pretty clearly, if you look at the 5 poems, it's unlikely that they are the work of one writer. We do not know actually who may have written them. Again, there is that question as to how soon after the fall of Jerusalem they may have been composed. Old Testament scholars very rarely know who is responsible for the writing of the books of the Old Testament. In the case of some of the prophetic books, for instance, like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel and so on, we can feel fairly confident that at least some of the material in those books comes from those particular historical named figures who were working at specific points in Israel's history. But by and large, we simply do not know who was responsible for the composition and for the various stages of composition and later editing and so on through which the books of the Old Testament passed. It's much more important generally to know the situation, the circumstances within Israel's history in which the books were kind of shaped into their relatively fixed and final form than it is to know particularly that they were written by this or that individual that we could identify.